Bush. I'm going to be your interviewer today. I've been trying to find a better word than interviewee, but apparently that's the word. What we're going to do is we're going to have a wonderful conversation here, but before we do that, I want to remind everybody that if you like the conversation, please go on the application for DragonCon and give this 5 stars. If you actually don't like the conversation, give us 5 sarcastic stars. We'll take it. I want to also remind everybody that the charity this year is the Arthritis Foundation. If I understand correctly, the Dragon is going to match up to $125,000 worth of donations from you and from us, so please make the Dragon pay. Let's see what we can do to help the fight against arthritis. Considering how many authors and writers and editors and et cetera that we have at this convention, I'm sure there's plenty of people who are concerned about that, either now or in the future. All right, so what I'm going to do is introduce our literary guest of honor. I want to let you guys know that she has not approved this introduction, so any errors are mine. Let's be clear.
That actually sounds a little alarming, Darin. I haven't approved it.
What? I will. That's my boss telling me what to do, so I have to listen to her. Anyway, so let me get through the introduction very, very quickly. Nancy Kress was born in Buffalo, New York, and was raised in upstate New York. She got a degree in elementary education and taught 4th grade. In 1973, she married and moved to Rochester, New York, and had 2 sons. She began writing fiction during all that free time associated with raising 2 infants. Her first story was published in 1976, her first novel in 81. In between, she earned an MS in education and an MA in English. She worked for an ad agency and taught in university. In 1990, she turned to full-time science fiction writing. Thank goodness, because that led to her most popular work, Beggars in Spain. As of a few days ago, Nancy is the author of 33 books, including 26 novels, 4 collections of short stories, and 3 books on writing. Although she began writing fantasy, she currently writes science fiction, often about the totally non-frightening topic of genetic engineering. Her work has been translated into 24 languages, the coolest one being Klingon. Unfortunately, she cannot check on the accuracy of the translations herself. Her work has won, everybody strap in, 6 Nebula Awards, 2 Hugo Awards, a Sturgeon Award, 2 Locus Awards, 5 Asimov Readers Awards, and a John W. Campbell Memorial Award. She has also won a Niels Klim Award for the best story translated into Danish, which is...
I did? I won that?
According to you, you did.
Oh, I must have been.
Yeah. So we're all learning something today, including our guest. Nancy served as the fiction columnist for Writer's Digest magazine for 16 years. In addition to writing, she often teaches at various venues around the country and abroad, including a visiting lectureship at the University of Leipzig, a 2017 writing class in Beijing, and the annual intensive workshop, Taos Toolbox, which she teaches every summer with Walter John Williams. Let's please give Nancy Kress, our literary guest of honor, a warm DragonCon welcome.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here.
It is great to have you. Now, we have one more piece of business before we get to the fun stuff, and I would like to ask if there's anybody waiting in the wings.
Hi, folks. Hi, Regina. So I am Regina Kirby, and I am the Senior Director of Programming for DragonCon. Unfortunately, Delta was not ready for Ms. Kress. Unfortunately, she lives near Seattle, and if some of you have seen the news, they have a little problem at their airport. So she did not make our opening ceremonies. So on behalf of DragonCon, I would like to present Ms. Kress her plaque for being our guest of honor. Thank you very much for joining us. She had a very long day that day and didn't get here until like midnight. But we are very glad to have you, and we hope that you had a wonderful time while you were here. And now I will step out of the way. I was her stand-in.
Thank you, Regina. Let's hope Delta doesn't lose this on the way back. Yeah, getting here, they told me at 3 in the morning, they sent me a text that my flight was going to be delayed. And they put me on another one, and then that one was delayed, and then it was delayed, and then it was delayed. And then finally they put me on something, and I got in past midnight. In Delta's defense, although it's not much of a defense, SeaTac, Seattle Tacoma Airport, was under cyber attack at the time, and all of the monitors were down. So customer service reps were working on their own laptops, which they brought to work, and trying to get passengers rebooked. So it wasn't entirely Delta's fault. But it was enough their fault that when they sent me this morning, how satisfied are you with Delta service survey? There got an earful.
Regina, Delta's not a sponsor, are they? Not anymore. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, wonderful airline.
Anyway, thank you very much for joining us, and I hope your trip home is much easier. So, thank you, folks.
Okay, bring it on.
You ready?
I'm ready.
All right, here we go. So, this is a little something I invented and trademarked called the Guided Evocative Assessment Catalog, or GEEK. And Nancy was warned there are questions coming, but has no idea what the questions are. She's been a
I
very
reserve
good
the right to remain silent. You
Okay,
know,
so
if the cops can allow that, you can allow that too.
exactly.
Okay. All right.
One thing I do want to say is that I probably should have told you this already. Is I don't really care what the answer is, as long as it is evocative
Of what? Evocative of what?
of anything.
All right.
Okay, well, let's do a couple, and you'll see what I'm talking about.
Okay.
All right, ready? Cat or dog?
Dog.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Coke or Pepsi?
Neither.
Car or truck?
Car.
Beach or mountain?
Beach.
Pen and paper or electronic?
Pen and paper by choice, electronics because unfortunately publishers will not accept handwritten manuscripts anymore.
Mac or PC?
PC.
Ninja or pirate?
To do what with? What are we talking about here?
This is a middle of the day panel, so we can't get R-rated just yet, but
Oh, well, if we're going to be R-rated, I guess pirate.
you heard it here at DragonCon. Fantasy or science fiction?
Oh, science fiction.
Star Trek or Star Wars?
Star Trek.
DC or Marvel?
No opinion.
Fair enough. Movie or television?
Well, I watch movies on television, so can I have a hybrid here?
Yes.
Okay.
That's one of the consequences of me letting them have their answers be whatever they want it to be.
You said I could.
I did, indeed. It's my fault. Comic book or graphic novel?
Graphic novel.
Hardcover or paperback?
Kindle.
Geek or nerd?
You mean which do I refer to myself as? Nerd.
Sure.
Geek seems to me to carry greater familiarity with electronics than I have or will ever have. Whereas if you play chess, as I do, you're almost automatically a nerd, especially if you're a woman.
So you have a lot of academic background on both sides of the classroom.
I do.
Did you at some point decide that you were either a nerd or a geek or both? How did that happen?
I never considered the question until this very second when you brought it up.
Thank you. I'll take credit for that. So what I want to start with is,
Does all of this lead to some conclusion? Like, a Myers-Briggs test or something?
well, there's a fee for that, but maybe we'll discuss
There's a
later.
fee for
No,
that?
no,
Okay,
that was it. That was
Okay.
it. I did like the fact that there were 8 or 9 of those questions were just like you had an answer, and a couple of them we sort of went off the rails a little bit, which is great, very entertaining. So I'm not going to ask you where do you get your ideas. Please don't ask authors that question. But do you consider yourself a fan?
I don't know. I have always considered myself a fan until I discovered fandom. And the reason, what I mean by that is, I've always read, well, I haven't always read SF. I'll come to that in a minute. But I've read SF and I considered myself a fan of science fiction and fantasy. But I'm not a member of fandom because I got here too late and because I am basically an introvert. And I don't participate in, I don't write fanfic, I don't get dressed up. So I don't know, can I qualify as a fan without doing those things?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. That was a complicated trick question.
It was very complicated. I apologize. Would you like a softball question next?
You can ask me whatever you want.
Okay, all right. So what I want to ask is, when did you start writing?
Okay, that's a complicated question. I'm going to go through this. I never discovered science fiction even existed until I was 14 years old. I know a lot of people, including maybe most of you, were reading it younger than that. And I know that any of you who are writers or other writers I know, they said, well, you know, I decided I was going to be a writer at 12 or 13 or 6 months old or whatever. But that wasn't my case. And the reason I never read any science fiction is I grew up in the 1950s in a very conservative small town. In the library, and we lived out in the country, so I didn't get to the public library very often because my mother couldn't drive. In the school library, there was a girls' section and a boys' section, because that's what happened in those days. And all of the science fiction was in the boys' section. And being a despicable goody-goody, I never went over there. So I read a lot of fairy tales. Andrew Lang's Red Book of Fairy Tales and Blue Book of Fairy Tales and Purple Book of all of them, Plaid Book. But I never saw any science fiction. And then when I was 14, I had my first boyfriend, and he was studying to be a concert pianist. And after school, I would go to his house and hang adoringly over the piano, because if you're a teenage girl, that's what you're supposed to do, or you were then. But I'm tone deaf. I could hang adoringly maybe 10 minutes tops. And then I would kind of inch away from the piano, and his father had bookshelves in there. And I'd pull out random books and start reading. And one of the random books I pulled out, the very first SF I'd ever seen, was Arthur Clarke's Childhood's End. And I was in love, and not with the pianist. This was a scale large enough that I was interested in it. And I started reading all the SF I could get my hands on. But it still never occurred to me to write it. And this also goes up with a very traditional, feminine, old-time school, because I'm very old, background. My mother sat me down when I was 12. She was the daughter of an immigrant, didn't even speak English, and she had a limited idea of what women could do. She sat me down and said, do you want to be a nurse, a secretary, or a teacher? That was literally all she could imagine. I thought about it, and I said, I want to be a teacher. And she said, okay, you'll have to go to college. So when it was time to send me to college, to a teaching school, her aunts descended, jabbering in Sicilian, and they're very disapproving. Why are you sending Nancy to college? She's pretty enough to get a husband. That was the thinking. But I went off to college and became a 4th grade teacher. And I liked it. But I never planned on writing. When I was a smaller child, I thought all writers were dead. I didn't know it was more writing was being produced. I thought it was a finite resource like oil. Because the writers that I was reading, Louisa May Alcott, Zane Grey, the writers that came my way, they were all dead. And it just didn't dawn on me when I was 8 or 9 years old that more writing was being produced. And then it wouldn't have dawned on me that I could be a person producing it. But what happened was, I married. We lived way out in the country. This seems to have been an unfortunate thing. And I had one toddler running around, and a very difficult pregnancy with my second child. My then husband was taking an MBA. So he would go into the city, do his job, and oftentimes he would stay downtown, grab some dinner, and go to his MBA classes. There were no women my age at home on the road. They were all older and had gone back to work. And I was going nuts. I really was. I love my children dearly. But to be out in the country with a toddler running around, throwing up with a second pregnancy, and having no adult company day after day is not conducive to a good state of mind. I started writing for something to do. Well, Kevin, my oldest child, was napping, and I wasn't in the bathroom throwing up. And I didn't take it seriously. I wrote stories, and I sent them out because that was what you were supposed to do with stories. And on the magazines, I had found addresses where I could send them. I didn't know that the whole paraphernalia of science fiction existed. I didn't discover it existed till after 3 stories had been sold. And then I discovered, somebody handed me an issue of Locus. And I discovered, oh, there are conventions, there are fans, there are all this stuff going out there that I had no idea about. So then I started going to conventions and started to really get into science fiction. And eventually I started writing novels. I was going to go back and teach the 4th grade, but by then it was the baby bust. They were laying off elementary school teachers. They weren't hiring them. So I picked up a couple more degrees and I taught college for a few years. Not tenure track, but with a master's. And eventually, my husband and I divorced, and I needed an actual job. So I went to work half-time as a copywriter for Xerox Corporation, because I could do a lot of the work at home. And that worked out pretty well. But I wrote mornings while the kids were in school, and Xerox got whatever was left over in the afternoon of me, unless I had a meeting at Xerox Square and had to be up there. But I never planned on being a writer. Nothing about my career was planned. The first 3 novels were fantasy. I don't know why. Then I switched to science fiction. I don't know why. Then I got very interested in hard SF, specifically genetic engineering. I don't know why. I never even had chemistry in high school. It conflicted with French 4, and now I can't speak French or do chemistry. But it just kind of evolved organically. When I'm looking back at my career and I want to be positive, I say it grew organically. When I'm looking at it otherwise, I say I tripped over it. And it just sort of kept tripping over various aspects of it. Longer than you wanted?
No, that was exactly the right length.
Okay.
Thank you so much. So, was there, I think you covered that one already. I was going to ask, what led you to try to publish? You said you were doing it to sort of fill the time. Was there a moment that you remember where you said to yourself, let me see if somebody else likes this?
No. I just knew that if you wrote a story, you should send it to a magazine that had stories in it. And, oh God, they're dreadful. They all came back, and I would get these notes that sometimes they'd be an encouraging one that would say, your prose is good, but you don't know how to write a story. This was absolutely true. Sometimes when I'm teaching, if I have a class of beginners and they're not used to critiquing, I will give them one of these old stories from my trunk, these much rejected old stories. And we will practice critiquing on it, because there's no way you're going to hurt my feelings about this. And also, I want my students to see that you can start out being that bad and still have a career, because they were bad. They really were bad.
Did you tell them it was yours? Or?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, at the beginning?
Yeah, I said, you're not going to hurt my feelings. What is wrong with this story? Well, yeah, everything. But you have to be more specific. What is wrong with this story? And then we would go through it, and that would lead to teaching moments to talk about different aspects of craft. I like teaching. I'm sorry that Taos Toolbox has ended because my co-teacher, Walter John Williams, has health issues and can't continue to do it. But for 13 years, we taught a Clarion-style 2-week, really intensive workshop. And a lot of published writers have come out of that, and I'm sorry that it's ended.
So what I want to let you guys know in the audience is that we're going to have time in a few minutes for Q&A. I don't know if we have a microphone on a stand or a roving microphone, but with this crew, if you want to just step forward and scream the question at me, I'll repeat it for you. But we will get to your questions if you have any. But I have a couple things I want to dig into, and I really have to exercise restraint here because I have a special education background, and neurochemistry is a hobby of mine, and Beggars in Spain completely threw entire chapters of my understanding of neurology right out the window.
Oh dear.
So what
You understand I make this up.
Well, that's where we're coming. I'm gonna put you on the spot here. But yes, so I was sitting there going, I wonder, I know the answer's not 0, but I can't imagine everyone in the room wants the two of us to talk about neurochemistry for 15 minutes. I'm not gonna do that.
I don't want to talk about neurochemistry for 15 minutes.
Well, that answers the first question I was going to ask you. One of the things that I found really amazing in Beggars in Spain was I made a career for years about explaining special education issues, neurochemistry, neurological disorders to people who didn't have any background or education in this. So as a professional in that field, I was very impressed with the way that you explained what are ridiculously complicated concepts in a way that could be absorbed and understood.
Well, thank you. Actually, Beggars in Spain, although it's my best known book, the science in it is in some ways superficial. I don't go into a lot of specific detail. As I got more interested in genetic, even though it's about, in case you don't know, it's about people who are genetically altered to not need to sleep. And I wrote this out of jealousy. I'm a long sleeper, and I have friends who can get by on 5 hours of sleep, night after night after night. And I thought, what if you didn't have to sleep at all? What if you had 8 more hours of life every day? How much more could you accomplish? How much more could you do? How much more could you feel and know? So it was written, that was the impetus for writing it. And I did do some research on sleep, including the neurochemistry of sleep, but not a lot, because at that point, the science itself hadn't grabbed me to the extent that it would later. Whereas in something like the novella Yesterday's Kin, which was a Nebula winner a few years ago, the science in that is as accurate as I could make it. And I really wanted to show what's involved in that kind of a quest for a scientific answer. But the science in that is kind of skims the surface. It doesn't go down to the cellular level, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Well, I thought you did a very good job of creating a situation that allowed essentially for two groups of people to talk back and forth about the premise of the science. So I thought,
thank you.
I thought that was, no, for those of you who haven't read it, you're wrong. Read this book, it's great. But what ends up happening is a billionaire, through his being a billionaire, is able to sort of find information about the latest wave of genetic manipulation for children before he's really legally supposed to have access to that information.
You have to do it in embryo, you have to do it in vitro with the embryo stage.
So he goes in there and he meets with the company. He says, I want my kid to be like that. And they're like, how do you even know about this? And he just completely ignores that question, essentially. So it's a wonderful premise that allows you to basically change one thing and then have this huge consequential culture shock and technology changes, and the United States of America gets turned on its head just by essentially this one change.
Because it follows it through 3 or 4 generations. And essentially, if you end up, and it's a dominant gene, it's inherited. So if you end up with groups of people that don't need to sleep, and in addition have other genetic enhancements because their families can afford it, increased intelligence, for instance, better health, and you have all the rest of us great unwashed, like me, who don't have it, the human race starts to bifurcate. And there's a backlash to that, because of course there is. The theme of the book essentially is, what do the haves owe the have-nots? And another thread fed into this book, and that came directly out of a workshop that I attended, not didn't talk, but attended. In the 1980s, there was a workshop for professional writers called Sycamore Hill. It was run by John Kessel on the North Carolina campus, because he taught there. And 17 professional writers would critique each other's manuscripts all morning, read each other's manuscripts for the next day all afternoon, and drink way too much white wine in the evening and argue about science fiction. One of the attendees was Bruce Sterling. Has anybody here read Bruce Sterling's work? Oh, good. Bruce Sterling is brilliant, and he is really an interesting person. However, he is not a tactful man. And I had brought a story that I knew was not among my best. It was long, and it took place in a human colony on an alien planet. And I knew that Bruce was going to eviscerate it, but I'd run out of time to do anything else, so I brought it. So I'm in the critique circle that morning, and we come to Bruce Sterling's critique. And what he says is, and I wish I could do the Austin accent, but I can't. And what he says is, well, Kress, this is a pretty good thing of its kind, but unfortunately its kind is totally obsolete, and you're just rearranging decorations on a moldy literary cake. It went downhill from there. His basic point was that I had taken tropes from 50s and 60s SF and kind of stuck them together to try to create a workable society. He said, I don't understand this society. I don't know where the resources are coming from. I don't know who has the power. I don't know how decisions are made. I don't know what they use for money. I don't understand the society. All societies have economic underpinnings, he said, and you haven't considered this. I went home and I licked my wounds for a couple weeks, and then I thought, damn it, Bruce is right. I didn't. So I started to think about economics, which I had never done before. And it seemed to me that if you want to write about what the haves owe the have-nots, there are 2 poles. Ayn Rand is at 1, where the answer is the haves don't owe the have-nots anything. The other is Ursula Le Guin in The Dispossessed, where society is completely communal, nobody owns anything, and children are heavily socialized into basically anarchy. But everybody is taken care of because nothing costs anything. Okay. I wasn't happy with either of those answers. The Rand answer, its selfishness turned me off, and also, if you've read Atlas Shrugged, its total lack of children. This is not a society in which you can even bring up children. The Le Guin, and I think Le Guin walked on water. She's my very favorite SF writer. But the dispossessed, one of the underlying premises is more faith in human beings than I have. She says if you remove property ownership, there will be no crime. Well, I don't really believe that. I think there's plenty of other reasons we could have crime. So neither of those answers for economics satisfied me. And so, but it did start me thinking about those things. And out of that came the economic underpinnings for the beggars in Spain, which is also a sub-theme along with the sleeplessness that goes through the novel. That's probably more information than you wanted, but that was where that came from.
Well, they're not here for me to ask you questions. They're here to hear you talk.
Oh,
so,
okay.
So let me go back
Can
to
I go
Baker's
back to
Bend.
fandom then and say something?
Absolutely.
That I wanted to say?
Yes, please.
I was going to do this in my speech when I accepted this plaque, but I didn't get the chance to give my speech, so I just want to say this. I think most writers come to a moment where they know this is their tribe. For some people, it's the first time they walk into a convention. For me, it was a little bit later. There may still be, a convention called BosCon in Boston. And it used to be held at the Sheraton, which had a north tower and a south tower. And I was at a party in one of those towers. This were the days when I could actually stay up and party late. It was so about 1 a.m, I went down from the party in one tower and I crossed over the lobby and waited for my elevator in the other tower. Because the Boston Sheraton is near the airport, and I think the same thing happens here, there's a lot of pilots and flight attendants who do layovers and stay overnight there. So I'm standing there at 1 a.m. waiting for the elevator, and a pilot and 3 flight attendants come in, dragging their little suitcases and looking totally exhausted. And they're waiting for the elevator too. When the elevator doors finally open at 1 a.m, there are 3 guys in there dressed as barbarians, and they have goatskin wine bags slung over their shoulder. And they have spears, this is before peace bonding, which they're pounding on the elevator floor as they chant a psalm to Ra, the sun god. As if it were choreographed, the pilot and all the flight attendants took a step backwards. And I got on the elevator. And I thought, I just made a choice. This is my tribe now.
Did you join in the singing?
Unfortunately, I didn't know the words.
Fair enough. The thing I wanted to ask you about Beggars in Spain was, and I know that you've got 30-something books, and this is kind of a trick question. If you somehow were convinced to go back and update Beggars in Spain, which I can't imagine at this point, I can talk you into it, would you be interested in updating the science?
I would make it more detailed.
More detail, okay.
There's a lot of research. I wrote Beggars in Spain, the novella in 1992, the novel a year later. And there is a lot of sleep research since then. And I think I could make it more convincing. I wouldn't change the story or the characters, but I would make the science more detailed and convincing. I've always been a science groupie. It just fascinates me. I don't have the mind for it. I don't have that kind of a mind. I'm not detailed enough oriented, and I'm not good at anything that's hands-on. When I was in college and I had to take biology for 2 semesters, I could easily memorize anything, and the tests were no problem for me. The labs were a problem. We had fruit flies. We were supposed to breed them. Some had purple eyes and some had red eyes. We were supposed to anesthetize them, put them under the microscope, count how many had purple eyes, how many had blue or red eyes, and construct a genetic chart showing the inheritance of from here. Well, all my fruit flies, I didn't use enough ether. They all revived under the microscope and went flying around the lab, and I never got to count them, and I got a D in that lab. Then later we were given a vial of some bacteria. They were a lot more adventurous in those days than they are in college now. And we were told some of them were pathogenic, although not fatal. And we were supposed to run it through a series of tests to find out what bacteria we had and then write up a lab report about it. Well, I dropped my vial and it broke on the floor. And there's the instructor going, don't touch it, don't touch it. And the grad students running around with disinfectant. And I got a D on that one too. I don't have the mind for a scientist. I don't have that skill set, but it fascinates me. And I've always been a science groupie.
Is there a particular aspect of science that's one of your favorites?
Genetic engineering.
Well, okay. Besides genetic engineering.
Yeah, the biology of the human mind and the human brain and the human body interests me a lot more. I mean, I have written stories where physics is the driver and not biology. For instance, Probability Moon, Probability Sun, and Probability Space is a trilogy in which physics is the driver. And that was very hard for me. I read a lot of books, I made a lot of notes. It was difficult for me to master the concepts to construct what I wanted to do, which was a fifth force in the universe. And I did. In addition to weak and strong force, gravity, and electromagnetism, I decided that there would be a fifth force which would be probability, which would explain why some radioactive material decays, has a 62% say of probability of decay, and other has a 41% probability. I thought there might be a force for this. So I invented a fifth force, complete with a messenger particle called a proton, with mass and spin, and worked it all in. And this was very, very difficult for me to do. There is actually, of course, a story, but that part comes easy for me. The characters, what happens to them, that part comes easy. It's trying to ground it in something that looks like reasonable science that is a little harder for me. And I'm never doing another trilogy based on physics.
So obviously, you've done a lot of research for your books.
I do research.
Is there a find from your research or a bit of research that stands out as being something that you thought was amazing or
Yes.
wonderful?
Yes, and alarming. I wrote two books. One is called Oaths and Miracles, and the second, which is better, is called Stinger. They are actually thrillers with an FBI agent, but they are based on some biotech, future biotech. And they did not do particularly well because my name was on them. So the thriller readers that I was intending to get never found them, and the science fiction readers started them and said, this isn't science fiction, and that was that. But they're among my favorites of my own books. When I was writing Oaths and Miracles, I wanted to write a virus that would be targeted at only one person. And I did a lot of research in how this could be possible. You have in every cell of your body something called an MHC complex. And it is individual. It's as individual as your fingerprints. I wanted a virus that would go only to one person's specifically MHC complex and get into their cells and nobody else's, only this one person. But the carrier would be a simple adenoid virus like a common cold. So if you have this virus and it's aimed at one person, say the president, you go to a rally, you sneeze and cough a lot, you hope that some people that are there catch this from you, and eventually it reaches the president. If it doesn't, you do it again, or whoever it is that you're trying to get at. Okay, I worked all of this out in excruciating detail. I was between marriages at that point, and I was dating a doctor, an oncologist, and I said, would you look at something for me and see if I'm going to make a total fool of myself? And I laid out for him, along the table, all of my notes, and I said, this, and then this, and then this, and then this. And if I do this, am I going to look really stupid if I put this in a book? And he said the single most frightening sentence I have ever heard. He said, I think this is possible. When the book came out, I got a call from Whitehead Biological Research Institute in Boston, which is where I had set my novel. And the scientist in there who is developing this is killed early on in the book because they've already got it and they no longer need him, the organization behind it. And he was working on envelope proteins. And I get this call, and I pick up the phone, and the doctor introduces himself and said, I'm a researcher at Whitehead, and we're reading your book, it's circulating around us, and I just want to ask you something. Who do you know up here? Because apparently they had a researcher working on envelope proteins who was as much of a womanizer and an asshole as the guy I created. And they wanted to know who I knew up there. And I had to approach, I don't know anybody up there. This is a coincidence. I knew that you worked on this kind of thing, and this is where it came from. But that was pretty alarming. When the doctor told me, Kishan told me, I think this is possible.
So you've talked about philosophers and science and your love of biology, genetic engineering, and also you mentioned earlier you made a switch from fantasy to science fiction. So I'm going to put something on the table and see what we can do with this. How do you feel about science fiction as not a genre, but as an extension of the human tradition of storytelling?
Oh, I think both science fiction and fantasy are extensions of the human ability for storytelling. Stories are the way we make sense of the world from the time we're very small. We don't think of them as stories, but that's what they are. If Og is sitting around the campfire and he got a tiger, he hit it over the head with his club and dragged it back. He tells his other people around the campfire in his Neolithic tribe about how he got this tiger. That's a story. It's a true story, but it's a story. It has a beginning and a middle and an end, the end being there's the tiger. Okay, so this is the way our brains process information. Storytelling is hardwired in. What makes science fiction different from other storytelling is that readers of science fiction are able to see, and writers are able to see the human patterns in an unfamiliar setting, sometimes really unfamiliar, in a way that people with less imagination cannot. My brothers, neither of them read science fiction. Well, one of them doesn't read any fiction. But they don't read science fiction, and neither does one of my sons. Whatever that X factor is that makes them see the human truth, able to see the human truth in the unhuman setting, is not there. And that's okay. I mean, they are who they are. But for those of us that regard science fiction as sort of, and I'm going to take this phrase from Ursula Le Guin, a thought experiment. She said that she wrote The Left Hand of Darkness, in which her characters are neither male nor female. They're genetically altered humans. So far in the future, they don't even remember us. They all have both sets of genitals, male and female. And at any time, when Chemer, which is like sex arousal, comes on, one or the other will become activated. So anybody can have a child. Anyone can become pregnant. Anyone can father a child. When she was asked why she did this, she said, I wanted to subtract gender from the human equation and see what was left. If there is no gender, how do you divide up work? How do you divide up child raising if gender isn't there? I think science fiction and fantasy are thought experiments in which we take questions dealing with humanity, but we look at them through a different lens to throw into sharper focus whatever it is that we're looking at. And what I wanted to do with Beggars in Spain was to look at what I started by saying, what are the haves of the have-nots? And I thought, what if you had, instead of just haves because they had a lot of money, they're really haves. They have a lot of other biological enhancements. What do they owe the have-nots, the rest of us great unwashed down here? And that was the question I wanted to explore, and that was the lens I chose. And it was a thought experiment, which I think all of good fantasy and science fiction is. I don't think all science fiction and fantasy is good science fiction and fantasy, however. But we don't want to go there.
Yeah, we're not going to name names, they might
That's
be
right.
here.
Not only that, I have enough enemies already.
Especially at Delta, right? So we've got about 20 minutes left. I wanted to know if anyone in the audience had a question they wanted to ask Nancy. I see a hand back here. Can you stand up and shout?
I'll come forward a little bit.
Thank you.
Shout loud enough. So I went to your signing, and I'm here as a part of the Electronic Frontiers Forum programming. And I woke up last night with this question, and I was like, this is a really good one. Yesterday I was on a panel about neural data and neural augmentation, which it seems that in the next decade or so, we are going to have the ability to augment human brains with these technologies that folks like Elon Musk are developing. And because I'm working with a group of activists and policymakers to try to figure out how we can make this a more just process, I'm curious if you have any advice for how to think about the human impacts of augmentation here in the real world, as we're about to face them in that way.
Well, it's hard to think about the impact of technology until it's already impacting. Because all technology is a double-edged sword. The day humans discovered fire, the crime of arson became a possibility. And that's true with anything. The day you discover you can have a sharp cutting edge, it was easier to butcher an animal and cook the meat. It's also easier to kill people. And even though our technology is far more sophisticated than that, it still has potential for both good and bad. Now, because I don't know what your specific neural augmentation are, I can only immediately imagine the good. But that doesn't mean that there won't be a misuse of it. The book that I just published, well, actually, it has such a complicated publishing history. The Kindle version will be available on the 19th of September. It's called Observer, and I wrote it with Dr. Robert Lanza. And it deals, in part, with the Japanese have been developing, and I'm sure you're aware of this, technology that hooks up to the human, with electrodes, to the human brain, and after it's trained, it translates the kind of things you're thinking about into images on a screen, so that what you're thinking about can be seen by other people. All right, I have taken this technology into the future and sharpened it a lot, okay, in Observer, in this novel. And the question that, and it seems to put you almost, well, I don't want to give the whole novel away because it's very complicated, but it has some bad misuses in there. And I can think that that would be possible. But I can't off the top of my head say, this is going to be the problems and this is going to be the good stuff. That's your job. What I can do is say that I'm pretty sure, like all of the rest of technology, it will be used and it will also be misused. As William Gibson says, the street finds its own uses for tech, and it will be. When we started the internet, I can remember the first internet website, and I can remember before that the bulletin boards. And there was an occasion on some bulletin board that SIFA was using, I think it was Genie back then, somebody had introduced an advertisement, very crude for one of their books or one of their merchandise. And a whole bunch of people said, no, don't wreck our internet. It should never become commercial. The internet has done a lot of good. It's also led to some truly toxic misinformation and side effects, senior scams, all kinds of things out there. And we all know that. And it like any other technology, there's an upside and a downside. If there weren't a downside, science fiction writers wouldn't have anything to write about. Because there are two questions that drive all fiction. Whether it's Cinderella, Hamlet, The Forever War, my novels, Star Wars, anything. And the first one is, what do these people want? Characters have to want something or you don't have a good story. Characters who just sort of drift passively along can live nowhere except the pages of a New Yorker fiction. Characters need to want something. The second question is, what can go wrong? And that's what writers are looking for. Whether it's Cinderella, and what can go wrong is they won't let her go to the ball, or it can go right on up through. And a novel will usually have a series of things going wrong. So those are the two questions. And if you're dealing with technology, you're looking for the places it can go wrong so you can write about it.
Any more questions? Oh, thank you, Sue. We've got a microphone coming for you. Thank you.
If you shout, I'll repeat the question afterwards.
Hello?
Oh.
There we go. I know a lot of writers say their characters talk to them and maybe do things they don't plan on them doing. Does it happen with you?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Do your characters do things you didn't plan or expect?
Yes, there's a psychological state, I know you must be familiar with this, called the flow state. When you enter flow, you've been reading a book, I'm sure this has happened to all of you. You've been reading a book and you're so immersed in the story that you're really kind of unaware of what's going on around you. And then somebody comes in the room and says your name, and it takes a couple times before you snap out of it. And then there's that moment of disorientation between the world of the book and the real world. That's happened to you when you've been reading? It happens when you're writing too, and it's the best thing about writing. When I'm in a flow state, the room disappears. I disappear. I am the character, and I am in that world. And it's just an incredible feeling, and that's when my characters will do things I sometimes don't plan, but I go with them. When I'm later on, I may come out of it and say, well, that was already the moment, it doesn't really work. But more often than not, I'll say, okay, why did it do that? There might be something here. And then I will try to think about what is here. But the flow state is our reward. Not a lot of writers, I have been fortunate enough to make a living at this, but it's not a living like John Scalzi or Hugh Howard are making. It's not that kind of a living. But a lot of writers don't make a living out of it. The money is not, at some point, not the point. The work is. And for me, the flow state, when I can get into it, I can't always, is the best reward that I can get. That and the fact when readers tell me they liked my work. That's the other thing.
I see a hand over here.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. My name is Sanjar. I kind of wanted to respond and also ask a question about what you said earlier about Le Guin, which also happens to be one of my favorite authors. The spectrum that you mentioned between Rand and Le Guin, in that Le Guin believes that there's no property. If there's no property, then there's no crime.
I'm not quite hearing you.
You can't hear me?
No, I can't. I'm sorry.
What do you want me to do? Come up? Or speak louder? Because the speakers, I think.
Oh, that's better.
coming
Hold the
this-
microphone.
Like this?
Yeah.
Is it better? Okay.
There you go.
I wanted to go back to your comment about Le Guin's belief in property-less society, and how you maybe it's questionable in your mind. I think part of the reason she wants us to think about other kinds of value systems comes from her parents, because they were anthropologists,
Yes.
right? And we know from history there were societies that just had completely different value systems, and she encourages us to say, okay, you can question capital, you can question property. It's not as if, because people thought divine kings were also unquestionable, and there are no more kings, almost. So,
The questioning of capitalism, that's not my problem with her. My problem is that when she removes all property, she says you would remove all crime. And I don't believe that. I think there are still going to be crimes of passion. There are still going to be crimes of some people who are just born cantankerous and don't want to fit into even a very benevolent society. I don't think that it would solve the question. She calls it an ambiguous dystopia for this very reason. She was way too smart to call it a utopia. And there is a scene where there is an intense food shortage, and a bunch of people are stuck on a train, and this is the dispossessed, and they don't have anything to eat for a couple days because the train has been for some way disabled. And the people in the nearby village have some, but they're reluctant to share because then they won't have enough for their children. And it's that question, again, of sharing resources. However, she did sidestep it. The train gets moving. And I kind of wish she hadn't. I wish she had taken that on more directly. What would have happened then? I just don't think that the abolishment of all ownership and of all laws and of all money is going to produce a crime, as crime-free a society as she does. Capitalism, to me anyway, seems completely out of control, and we need to do something about it. It isn't that I don't think there are other ways of living. It's also true, the only way you can have a completely different society is a completely sharing one. It can be small, like a band of people wandering around in the Neolithic. You can have a band of people. Or, as she does in The Dispossessed, you can heavily socialize your children, so that this is the way the society ought to be, and giving ought to be more important than acquiring. We don't do that. But it would require a lot of heavy-duty socialization. And in a society with as many different subcultures as the United States, you're never going to get that consensus. So I think we need to go, and in a population that of our world is already, what, 8 billion? You're never going to get enough consensus either. And we are basically screwed at this point. I don't know what the answer is. If I knew what the answer is, I would be a politician, and God, I don't want to be a politician.
Yeah. Anyone else? Okay, gentleman over here.
I know Beggar Star is originally a short story, and I was just wondering, you decided to write more? Was that because it wanted to go in the Nebula, or is it, you're like, I guess I
It was a
need more
novella. It was a novella, 40,000 words, and it won both the Hugo and the Nebula. But that's not the reason that I wanted to continue it. The more I thought about it, the more I thought, the story isn't done yet. What happens to Elisha next? Where does it go? And that's usually the reason that I've committed trilogy. I once swore I would never commit trilogy, and now I've done it 3 times.
Any other hands? I can come up with something. Oh, I think we've got all the way over here. We've got a question.
No.
Did you put your hand up?
Yes.
Then it's you.
I'm a new parent. You started your writing career when you had kids, and you've taught a lot of writing classes. Any advice to getting back in the routine once you have children?
Yeah, you have to invent the stratagems that work for you. I'm a morning person. I always have been. When the kids were small, I would get up before they did, which meant 5 in the morning, and write then. Because at 5 in the morning, unlike my husband who can't remember his name until about 10 in the morning, that's when I'm sharpest. I would try to work with my biological rhythm. I also, every penny I made from short stories when I started writing went to pay babysitters. My then husband was not very supportive of this, and this is one reason he is not did not stay my husband. But every penny I earned, I would pay a babysitter to watch the kids for a couple hours so that I could write the next one. When they got older and they were teenagers, I had a sign on my study door, and it said, "Novel in progress. Do not come in unless someone is bleeding or something is on fire. This means you." And after the first time when Brian came in saying, "Mom, do I have any clean socks?" and I almost bit off his head, they learned that no, they're not coming in. If they wait till I come out, I will be pleasant and I will probably give them whatever it is they want, but I want those 2 hours in there. And that was made very clear. Neither of them were very impressed with a mother who wrote science fiction, because if your own mother did it, how interesting can it be?
Oh, ouch. So I'm gonna risk this question. You let me know if you don't want to touch it. How do you feel about artificial intelligence as it applies to writing?
I don't think that at the point it's developed right now that it's very good. Ted Chiang has an extremely interesting article in a recent issue of The New Yorker. It may be only The New Yorker online, or it may also be in the print version, where he's saying that every writing story is choices. From the first word on, you're making choices. And you're not only making word choice, you're making choices of what your characters will do, what your setting looks like. And you can write a program, you can give a prompt to an AI, say. This is what he says. If you give it 100 specifications for this, it will write something. But a story, even a short story, is many thousand times more than 100 prompts, 100 specifications, because it involves more than that many choices. So what you get is a story from an AI. Again, I'm quoting Ted, for whom I have enormous respect. That it starts out all right, and then it falters and gets into mundane and uninspired choices, because all it can do is take them from existing works in the internet and stick them together. Said to get it to write an original story, you'd have to give it about 10,000 original choices, and if you're going to do that, you might as well write the story yourself. So he's not really, and he knows a lot more about computers than I do, which is practically true of 99% of the population knows more about computers than I do. But I was very impressed with this. And I do know from talking to editors, Neil Clark, as you probably know, closed submissions for a long while to Clark's World because he was getting so much AI-written crap. And he knew it was crap, but it still takes time to read the first couple pages and determine that it's crap, and he hasn't got that kind of time. Sheila Williams did the same thing at Asimov's. And she says, you learn to tell if it's AI written pretty quickly, but it takes time. And what they were doing is, for a while, they were only accepting stories from people who they knew, and they knew wouldn't be using AI, like, for instance, me. And then they went on to something a little more, where you have to sign something in your submission, some of them, on your submission page that says this was not written by an AI. But they're still very wary because it's so time-consuming to wade through all that stuff. So that's the state now. What do I think AI will look like in the future as far as writing fiction? I have absolutely no idea. I just hope. I don't know what if they do write it, what they're going to do with all the money they're going to make, those AIs.
Build a spaceship and leave us behind, probably.
Oh, I wrote that story. Yeah, I did. It's called Savior.
Excellent. So is there a little experimental question here before we wrap up? Is there I assume you've been interviewed a gazillion times at this point with all the awards and everything. Is there a question that you're waiting for someone to ask you, that you're looking forward to answering but no one has gotten around to asking you?
Nobody? In 45 years?
Well, almost no.
Yeah. If you hadn't had a mother who sat you down and said, teacher, nurse, or secretary, if I had been a young woman now, in today's environment, what would I have wanted to do? I've always regretted that I never went to law school. Not because I want to be a lawyer, but because after a couple years as a prosecutor, low level, I would have liked to become the next Scott Turow and write legal thrillers. And I don't really have the background. The two legal thrillers I wrote, Oaths and Miracles and Stinger, are not courtroom dramas. They're a fledgling FBI agent who doesn't fit the usual profile for an FBI agent. And I have had FBI agents tell me they really enjoyed them and thought they were well done. But I can't do a courtroom battle with the intricacies of a Scott Turow or a John Grisham because I don't have the knowledge. And although I did research things like the RICO statutes for those two novels, and I learned a lot, it's not the same as actually having experience in the courtroom and actually having that kind of. I still would have been a writer, but I think I might have been a different kind of writer if I was a young woman now and had the ability to go to law school at this point. And don't tell me it's not too late. I'm 76. It's too late.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Wonderful discussion. Everybody, big round of applause. Nancy Kress.
Well, thank you, dear. I appreciate it. And thank all of you. You've been a really good audience.
Thank you so much, everybody.